Hello everyone. In this lesson, you will learn how to solve multi-step word problems. We're going to use a lot of the same techniques with single-step word problems, but our main learning target today is to learn how to attack, model, and solve multi-step word problems. Let's get started. Okay, our very first thing to do when we are attacking a multi-step problem solving is to read the entire problem, annotate the important information, and pull it out so we're able to successfully solve. So, I'm going to read the entire problem first before I annotate to get a better idea of what the entire problem is about. Let's go ahead and get started. James is a pilot. He traveled 10,290 miles on his first flight. On his second flight, he traveled 425 more miles than the first flight. On his third flight, he traveled 8,732 miles. About how many miles did he travel on all three flights? All right, now, I know there's three flights, so because I just read it. So I know I'm going to have a tape diagram for the first flight. I'll use that tape diagram for the second flight, and another tape diagram for the third flight. Now, let me go back and annotate. He traveled 10,290 miles on flight number 1. On his second flight, he traveled 425 more miles than the first. So that means plus the first flight. On his third flight, he traveled 8,732 miles. That means to round or estimate to round. How many miles did he travel on all three flights? That means I need a total of all the miles he traveled. So let me go back and use my tape diagrams. Flight number 1, I know I'm going to need 10,290. Flight number 2, it's 425 more than flight number 1, which means I'm going to add 10,290. Flight number 3, I know exactly how many he traveled, 8,732. Now, my very first step in this problem solving is to come up with how many he traveled in flight number 2. So I have to figure that out first. After I figure that out, I can combine steps number 1, 2, and 3, all three flights, to get my total. So now I have my steps in my head. I know I'm going to do number 1 first. The very first thing I'm going to do is solve for my second flight. That's the very first thing I'm going to do. And then step number 2, I'm going to add all three flights together. Oops. Okay, I know that's messy, but you understand what I'm saying. So, I also have to remember that I am rounding. So before I add, I'm going to make sure I round. So I may need to change that idea. So maybe what I need to do is change my step number 2 to a step number 3. And my step number 2 needs to be what? Round. Before I solve it. Would you agree with that? Yep, I agree. I think I need to change rounding to my step number 1. So do you see how sometimes when you're thinking about a problem, the idea of how you're going to solve the problem doesn't work, which means you need to revamp. Now I've stopped and I thought about my mistakes. I figured out what I want to do next and my order. So let's get that straight and let's do that again, just to make sure we know what we're doing. Problem solving is not a quick answer. You need to slow down and make sure you're getting everything exactly the way you want it. Okay, now that we have worked out the steps that we think we're going to solve the problem, we've gone over, we have rethought how we were going to do things, we've taken some time to solve our problem in our head before we started, and we have a pretty good method of solving. So let's follow those steps. Step 1, we're going to round all the values. Step 2, we're going to find the amount traveled during the second flight. In step 3, we're going to add the 3 flights together to get a total amount of miles traveled. Now, step 3 is really answering our question, but we're not going to be able to go straight to the answer on this one. We're going to have to do 2 other steps before we can even get the final answer, which is what a lot of people have problems with. They want to jump in and say, here's the answer before they actually go through all the steps needed. So now, let's get started. The very first thing I want to realize is that in flight 1, there's 10,290 miles. Well, if I'm going to round first, what is that about? I'm going to go ahead and say that is about 10,000 miles. How do I know that? Because that 2 is going to tell that 0 to stay. So I'm going to say that. So I already have done flight 2 because I've already said this is about 10,000 miles. So that gives this amount right here, which is about 400 miles. Now I'm on flight 3, which that 7 is going to tell that 8 to score. So this is going to be about 9,000 miles. So step 1 is done. Now I need step 2. Step 2 is to do what? It is to find the amount traveled during the second flight. How do I do that? Well, I've already determined when I read that I was going to need to add. So what is my total amount for my second flight? Well, what's 10,000s plus 400s? It's 10,400. So it's 10,000s and 400. Step 2 is done. Finally, my last step to get my answers is to add all 3 flights together. All right, so I'm going to line these digits up just to make sure that nothing's going to go wrong. I have 10,000, I have 10,400, and finally I have 9,000. Normally, I don't like to add 3 numbers together at a time because it gets confusing and it's a lot of room for mistakes. But these are pretty simple because they're rounding problems. I'm going to go ahead and do it. My 1s is 0. My 10s will be 0. My 100s is only 4. My 1000s is 9, and my 10,000s is 20. So, my answer is about 29,400. Now, I want to make sure that I communicate this answer correctly as part of the answer, so everyone will clearly understand I know what the answer is. To do that, I need to make sure that I write or label my answer. So, 29,400 miles in all. And I'm going to put a big old square around it so you can't mistake what the answer to my problem is. All right, I've given you some great tips on multi-step problem solving. Now it's your turn to attack some problems on your own. Have fun.